statute. Is that something that you're looking at? Or let me just simply, since I'm out of time, encourage you to take a hard look at that, because that would be a meaningful step that could help, again, ensure that the background checks that should be completed, even without additional legislation, are in fact completed. I hope you'll consider that seriously, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. The chair will now recognize himself. Madam Attorney General, I want to tell you I enjoyed visiting with you recently, and I want to thank you for Sally Yates' recent trip to South Carolina, which was very well received. There are three areas I want to cover with you. First would be Mr. Kadzik's letter to Congress recently, and I'm going to paraphrase one of the paragraphs, but it's a pretty close paraphrase. The IRS mishandled tax-exempt applications in a manner that disproportionately impacted conservative groups. I read that to mean that he found a discriminatory effect. In other words, there were similarly situated people, but there was a disparate impact on conservative groups. That's, I think, the only way to read that paragraph in Mr. Kadzik's letter. He then wrote, it left the appearance that the IRS conduct was motivated by political, discriminatory, corrupt, or other inappropriate motives. So you have a discriminatory effect, but he said the cause, the motive, was mismanagement as opposed to a crime. And then that got me thinking, if my sheriff stopped only red cars for speeding, at what point is it not mismanagement, but it actually is circumstantial evidence of intent?
Well, with respect to the actions that you referred to, Congressman, I think you certainly are accurate when you indicate that our letter noted that the groups that had complained were treated differently from other groups, and they were also treated in a way that did not advance their applications. They were treated badly. So one can understand their concerns and the issues that they raised. With respect to the investigation, as we outline in our letter, under the relevant statutes that we were reviewing, we needed to find evidence of criminal intent. That intent was not there. With respect to the example that you raise, certainly there are certain statutes that take into effect a discriminatory impact. But again, even in our civil rights laws, if one had a discriminatory impact, you would not necessarily be able to prove a discriminatory intent. It's really hard to prove intent, really hard, which is why usually you use circumstantial evidence. And if female voters were required to show 2 forms of ID, but male voters were only required to show 1, how many voters would have to pass through the prompter before you would say that's circumstantial evidence of an intent to discriminate? Never do you have direct evidence of intent. It's really hard to prove intent, which is why we typically use circumstantial evidence. And I noted in Mr. Kadzik's letter, he didn't say there was insufficient evidence. He said there was no evidence. But would you agree with me that there's a very big difference between saying insufficient evidence and absolutely no evidence, which is what he wrote. He found no evidence of any intent to discriminate, despite the fact that there's a discriminatory effect. Well, I think the letter does speak for itself in that regard. What I would say is that, Congressman, as a general matter in how we handle our criminal investigations, we do look for evidence of intent, and it comes in a number of ways, some circumstantial, some direct. Every case is different. In every investigation, as in this investigation, we gather all the evidence, we gather all the facts, and we apply the law to those facts, and let that determine the answer. I'm with you, Madam Attorney General, but you concede a discriminatory effect. So that's half of what you have to prove, and it's already there. You've conceded that. And we've got emails from Ms. Lerner that we need a plan, but we have to be cautious that it's not per se a political project. I think a jury would find that to be an interesting email. She worried mightily that a Republican control of the Senate might be tantamount to a Republican president, and she wasn't thrilled about that. That would be circumstantial evidence of a political motivation. She referred to the Tea Party as very dangerous. I mean, how many pieces of circumstantial evidence, keeping in mind The author of the letter didn't say insufficient. I could have lived with it if you'd said, look, our prosecutors just couldn't make the case. It's a close call. It's a jump ball. We couldn't make the case. That's not what he said. He said there's no evidence. I just cited 3 emails that I think would be evidence of some intent. Don't you think?
Well, Congressman, as I said, I think the letter in its full entirety speaks for itself and does outline not only all of the issues that you raised, but the host of other things that were reviewed and looked at in the course of the investigation, and does explain the conclusions to which the department came. With respect to the referral, the issue was whether or not there was evidence of a criminal intent. That is to say, did one act on certain views? Was that the reason for the actions? And as we've noted in our letter, and that we've offered to have in further briefings with you, we did not find evidence of that through the million pages of documents and hundreds of witnesses that were interviewed.
I would love to take you up on that offer for a private debriefing, because I need somebody to explain to me the difference between specific intent and general intent, because as I read her emails, even some of the mediocre prosecutors on this panel, I think, could get to a jury given the evidence that they have. I want to touch on 2 other issues, and then, because there's a trend of going over, I would invite you at some point, and this is going to be a bipartisan comment, because this goes back to 2004. And 2004, there was a Republican administration. If you look at the firearms prosecutions from 2004 to 2012, you're going to be shocked at how few prosecutions there were, not for 924C, not for firearms offenses that happened during a crime of violence, but I mean lying and buying, selling a gun to somebody who's been adjudicated mentally ill, somebody who's been committed. There were 22 guilty adjudications over the course of 9 years for people possessing firearms who were users or addicts of drugs. 22 in 9 years. So when I hear my friend from Florida talk about the need for more gun laws, yes, we're going to say, how are you doing with the ones you currently have? And I would invite your attention to this chart, which came from former Attorney General Holder, provided it to us. I think you're going to be shocked at how few, and I get that there's not much jury appeal. Trust me, I get that it is hard to go in front of a jury in a lying and buying case. But you noted earlier the focus on firearms cases in the context of violent crime. And I think we would all agree the objective is to prevent the violent crime, not to do a really good job prosecuting it afterward, but to keep it from happening in the first place, which is why I would invite your attention to this. My last point is simply this. You have been asked repeatedly this morning to comment on ongoing investigations, and you always give the same answer. And it's the exact same answer that Marino gave me in the back, who's a former U.S. attorney, and it's the exact same answer Mr. Radcliffe gave me in the back, who's a former U.S. attorney, which is you can neither confirm nor deny the existence of an ongoing investigation, and if we happen to know about one, you're not going to comment on it. That's exactly what you should say. I'm just wondering why the president didn't get that memo. And you may, in your well of souls, believe that it does not impact Director Comey or you, and it may not. But I promise you it impacts the perception of my fellow citizens when the person who is responsible for executing the laws in this country prejudges the outcome of investigations. It may not impact the reality. I promise you it impacts the perception, and that's equally dangerous. And with that, I would recognize a gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Gutierrez.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And welcome, Attorney General.
Thank you, sir.
I posed the same question to the FBI director. I want your advice, and I'd like to work with you. In my hometown of Chicago, there are 40, 50 shootings any given weekend. That's a whole classroom of children, and it's unacceptable. And we need more federal action, I think. Because whatever we do in Chicago, according to a city report from the mayor's office and the Chicago Police Department, 60% of the guns are coming from Wisconsin, Indiana, and Mississippi, all states that have weaker gun laws than the city of Chicago does. We know this thanks to the Chicago Police Department's tracking of trace data, meaning that the Chicago Police Department traces every single gun it recovers to determine whether it was originally sold and how it may have entered the illegal market. So given that the majority party in Congress refuses to take up, despite widespread and robust support for gun control legislation, a couple of questions. What's your advice to me as an individual member of Congress who supports gun control, and how can I help curb gun violence in Chicago? And second, will the Justice Department encourage the police departments everywhere in the nation to collect trace data on illegal gun trafficking like we do in Chicago? So first, you're in Chicago, you're a member of Congress, what's your advice? And second, trace the guns. We're doing it in Chicago. What do you think about across the nation?
Congressman, thank you for the question. You certainly raise an area of concern and priority for the Department of Justice, which is, of course, violence, be it gun violence or any type of violence in our cities as it affects our children, not only those who are the actual victims, but children who are exposed to violence, of course, suffer greatly, as we know, in their later development as well. We feel that the city of Chicago is certainly taking a concerted look at this problem, and I'm extremely proud to note that the federal government, through the U.S. Attorney's Office in Chicago, is working very closely with local law enforcement on this issue, focusing on the issue of not just firearms, but also the gang violence in Chicago as well. We also have a very strong presence with our federal agencies, FBI as well as ATF, who works closely with the Chicago Police Department on the E-Trace program that you mentioned. We do find it to be a very useful program. We do find it to be something that arms us with the data to trace the source of weapons into neighborhoods who suffer so grievously from them. And certainly it's an example that certainly we would hope could be exported to other cities as well, as you have noted. And I can tell you that we are committed to continuing to work with the City of Chicago and all of our major cities in violence reduction programs. In fact, Chicago was represented at the Violence Reduction Summit that I held just last month with the mayor and the police chief, and we had a very robust discussion about the causes of violence, some of the ways in which the department could be helpful in very targeted ways, whether it is increasing our task force presence, whether it is focusing on dangerous fugitives in the area, whether it is focusing on violence prevention efforts as well. So we remain committed to working not just with Chicago, but all of our cities who are experiencing these troubling issues.
So if you were to suffer something as egregious as a demotion to a member of Congress from your high position as Attorney General, what do you think? What would you do? You're back in Chicago. You got demoted. You're not the Attorney General. You're just one of us, 430.
Well, I certainly would not call that a demotion. I think all of us in public service have a great opportunity
I guess you get my
to serve our people. To serve our people. And certainly I think that within this body there's a lot of significant discussion going on. Obviously the resources to fund the programs that we have on the ground are essential in funding the department's budget that focuses on the Smart on Crime initiative, which does focus on violence reduction as well as reentry and recidivism, because of course a grave concern is as people return home to their communities that they not return to violence as well. So certainly the resources that would be useful for the department's overall budget, and particularly when it comes to firearms, the resources for ATF to continue its vigorous enforcement of the firearms laws and the E-Trace program would be very beneficial.
Lastly, I want to, so there's a letter from my colleagues, Congressmen Ruben Gallegos and Robin Kelly from Chicago. And they've asked to meet with you with a group of members of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus and Black Caucus. And I want to put it in some context for all the members and why we would invite you to meet, particularly with that group. Because African Americans are 13% of the population, but they constitute over half of all the homicides, over half. So 13%. 55% all the deaths given on firearms. And interesting, Latinos are relatively less likely to own a firearm than the general population. And yet again, they disproportionately die due to gun violence. So you have a population that doesn't own guns but dies of guns, and 13% black population and over half of the deaths. So just would you? I know you got. I hope you got the letter, and so I love working with those two colleagues of mine. And I was wondering if you would accept an invitation to come and meet with us.
I look forward to meeting with the caucus. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Attorney General.
Gentlemen,